Good evening, everybody. As you can see, I have no voice, but that's okay because I don't need to talk. There's some people behind that are in the green room that is going to give you a whole lot of information today. Remember, we are today introducing the newest broadcasters for WLAB 107 dot three, the Red. Um, you got me tonight. My brother had a school engagement, but with that, we always do our countdown. So let's go. We're back. I am so excited to introduce. I'm getting feedback somewhere. It's okay. Um, introduce our special guest for tonight, the Lancaster History Organization, and they have an amazing project that they're working on. I just was listening to it when we were talking. I'm so very excited. I feel dumb, but but I am excited to learn more history about about our city of Lancaster. So with that said, I'm going to introduce yeah, Mr. Tom Ryan, and he will introduce everyone else. Hey, Mr. Tom, how are you this evening?
I'm doing great, Joy. Thank you.
I'm
Ladies
very
and gentlemen, I want to thank you for tuning in and joining us tonight for this first of 12 podcast sessions where we're going to share with you our vision and the various pieces behind the creation of a new Center for History and Democracy in Lancaster that looks squarely at the lives of two of the most remarkable citizens who have called Lancaster their home: Lydia Hamilton Smith and Thaddeus Stevens. Remarkable Congressman Stevens in the middle of the 19th century, and his companion and confidant, Lydia Hamilton Smith, who managed many of his affairs, his household, some of his business dealings, a lot of his social relationships, both at home and in Washington, D.C., during his time of political service. We have a great crew of folks gathered with us tonight. And over the course of this evening, you'll get to know each of them a little bit better. And hopefully, you'll be enticed to come back on a weekly basis for the next 12 weeks to engage yourself with the lives of these two remarkable people and to learn why their lives and their history is extremely important in this moment, in this community, and in our country. We're going to go around the Zoom here, and I'm going to have each person introduce themselves. I'm the president and CEO of Lancaster History. I have been working in this field in Lancaster in this organization for now my 26th year. I am honored and privileged to be able to join you tonight and to have had the experience of working for more than 2.5 decades now with some of the most remarkable people in our community. I've gotten to learn the history of this community more and more each day, but those who are gathered with me tonight will also be sharing a lot of that love for our local history and also the passion to kind of share it with others and learn what we can from the past to help transform our present day. I'd first like to introduce one of the chairs of our steering committee for this project, and that is Linwood Sloan. Linwood, take the floor for a moment.
Greetings to you all within the sound of our voice and the vision of this exchange this evening. My name is Linwood Sloan. Most of my colleagues and close friends know me as Lenny, and I have to say that Linwood is the guy who wears the suit to the board meeting, and Lenny is the artist who was trained by Joffrey Ballet and Alvin Ailey Company to perform, and had an incredible career at the time that I discovered the notion of gravity, and I decided to go to Lincoln Center, Juilliard, for a directing fellowship, and became a Broadway director. At the time that I decided to shift my focus from the performance stage to the classroom, I became a historian and educator, and I'm glad to serve as the executive director of the International Global Network for Peace at the state's capital, on the governor's Capital Preservation Commission, on the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, and my very exciting time spent is as a board member for Lancaster History Organization.
Thank you, Lenny. It's great to have you here, and it's wonderful to have you as part of the whole mix of folks who are going to make this dream a reality. Now I'd like to have Randy Harris introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hey, everybody. Great to be here. And it's great to follow our friend Lenwood. I always call him Lenwood. It's not Lenny. I just don't know him in that capacity. I like him in the suit, in the official capacity. But he's on the board of Lancaster History, and that's really cool. And I'm so happy to be one of the newest employees of Lancaster History to help focus this project to its full fruition. It's such an amazing opportunity to be here with you all and to discuss the opportunities we have to explore this history, which just unfolds every time you look into what's been happening with these historical characters and where we're going into the future with this project. It is such an amazing community enterprise, a community gift, I guess that's what you could say. And I'm so happy to be here with every one of you and the board of Lancaster History and the community to continue working. So I was involved. I'm a recovering journalist from Pittsburgh. And I came here 20 plus years ago to work at the Historic Preservation Trust of Lancaster County. And by dint of history confluence of all kinds of factors, I was involved 20 plus years ago with helping to preserve the Lydia Hamilton Smith, Thaddeus Stevens site, so that we can move it to the platform that we have today. So we have a lot of opportunities to discuss that and a lot of subjects to cross. So I'll just pass that off back to Tom or to Robin to explain what her role is.
Thank you, Randy. And you'll be hearing more from Randy later on in the program today, when he'll kind of share with you some of a little glimpse of the future sessions in this podcast. Sounds like he's sending it to you, Robin.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy and Tom. I'm Robin Surratt. I'm the Vice President for Lancaster History, and really excited to be doing this with you all tonight. I'm particularly honored to be sitting in this Zoom room with these four characters. It's an honor. I'm glad I didn't have to go right after Lenny's description. Not that I don't find Randy's equally intimidating to follow, but Alvin Ailey and Juilliard, and I mean, come on, Lenny fighting gravity sounds like something I'd really like to watch. I've been with Lancaster History for 15 years. I was at the Winterthur Museum prior to that, and I have background in early American culture. I have to say, moving to Lancaster in 2007 made me one of the converted. I have fallen deeply in love with the history of this community, not to mention a number of its places, its historic landmarks, its people, its stories. And so it's really been an honor to serve this organization, and in particular, as we go into this project to honor the legacies of Lydia Hamilton Smith and Thaddeus Stevens. I can't think of anything more exciting and just thrilling to be a part of than this project. So I'm delighted we get to share it with you all tonight.
Right. Let's hear from another fairly recent addition to the Lancaster History Board of Directors, Tom Baldridge. You may know him from some other capacities.
I thought you were going to call me Thomas, but that's okay. And I call him Lenwood also, but and I'm not intimidated by his story. I'm intimidated by his resonant voice. Nonetheless, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us to hear more about this special project that I hope you will stay tuned for the remaining podcasts in this weekly series to get the full story. My name is Tom Baldridge. I'm the president of the Lancaster Chamber. I've been in that role for 22 years and will be retiring in June. Frankly, in some ways, then dedicating more time to this project because it's worthy of a lot of people's time and energy because of the excitement I think that can surround it. I am on the board of Lancaster History. I've been on for 2 years now, so I'm fairly new, but I have been a longtime fan and supporter of not just the organization and Tom and Robin, but history in general in Lancaster County. My father was a history professor at Muhlenberg College, which I share with a lot of people, and I think dinner conversations at our house naturally gave me an interest in history. And it just so happened that one of my father's historical heroes was Thaddeus Stevens. And so I had a little bit of knowledge of him when I came to Lancaster. But I got to tell you, over the time that I've been here, my appreciation for that man and Lydia Hamilton Smith has grown exponentially. I'll share maybe a little bit about that more, but they are people of amazing principle and integrity, and they deserve to be recognized, but more importantly, I think honored and deserve tribute to their voices so that we can continue that voice into the future. And that's what this project and these podcasts and our energy will be about over the course of the next few weeks and years.
Great. Thank you, Tom. There's one other person that I want to just mention or acknowledge at this time, and that's the man behind the scene, the creator of WLAB, the Reverend Lou Butcher. I want to commend Reverend Butcher for creating this vehicle to share, on the one hand, faith, which is kind of the hallmark of his life in this community, but also to invite history into the conversation. So congratulations to WLAB. I suspect those might be Reverend Butcher's initials, but I think it's also fascinating that it's a short term for laboratory. And laboratories are where things come together, where they're discovered, where they're explored. So think about WLAB as a place to explore, whether it's your faith or whether it's your history or some other aspect of the community. I think it's kind of a nice name for this station. I also want to remind folks that these broadcasts will occur 3 times each week: Tuesdays at 10 o'clock in the morning, Thursdays at 10 o'clock at night, and Saturdays at 5 p.m. They're also going to be archived at Lancaster History and made available in that fashion, and any other ways that they will be made available, we will let you know. We'd like to turn a little bit to the background behind the story to understand where this all arose from. So, and I want to ask Randy Harris in particular about this. When did the idea of a history museum or a center dedicated or inspired by the experience and the legacy of Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith, where did that first take place?
Well, Tom, like a lot of historic preservation projects, it's kind of happenstance in a lot of ways. It's because sometimes there was a property being neglected or overlooked. One of the major issues involved in preserving historic properties from a practicing standpoint is that people tend to think of historic properties as the shining mansion on the hill, exceptional architecture. But the fabric of a community, its row houses, its warehouses, its corner stores, that's what really is together makes up historic neighborhoods and communities, which are really worth saving, because as you look around at any demographic in the country, people want to go to places that have meaning, have resonance, have heritage reflections, and that's kind of what happened here.
Yeah, we also know that in communities, change is always happening. So,
exactly.
New buildings go up, old buildings sometimes come down.
Yep.
And we know that partly behind this effort was the vision of a new convention center in Lancaster. So
Right.
let's start there maybe a little bit and share with us a little bit how that piece of change in this community was a contributor to that led us to this moment.
Good point. And I invite Tom Baldridge, who has been, involved in all of these activities as well from the chamber standpoint, to chime in as well. So in the mid 90s, Lancaster suffered the loss of, like so many other communities, the loss of its big downtown department store, the Wat & Shand, which was an institution that went back 125 years. And so the community said, we must do something with this property because it'll just leave this big void in the absolute square of downtown. So that created the notion of Penn Square Partners. That would be Lancaster Newspapers, Fulton Bank, and High Real Estate coming together to form some entity to find a new use for that amazing property that we all know and love on the square in Lancaster. And the idea was a conference center and maybe a hotel. Let's bring a hotel in and figure out what can happen. On the corner of that whole block downtown was this little vastly altered, not so attractive looking property that was associated with and owned by Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith. As it turns out, I was the director of the Historic Preservation Trust at the time, and my organization as a conservation preservation group held a property interest in those buildings in the form of conservation easements, much like farmland is protected and much like woodlands are protected by various conservation groups. We had a stake in that to be able to say these properties are worth saving. The story behind these buildings can be an integral part and a positive addition to what the community wanted to do with this corner lot, this whole quadrant of the downtown square. So that's kind of just the idea.
So rather than just being something that might get in the way of the vision for a convention center, what folks seemed to be realizing at the time was this could be a real asset and a real draw that would help bring people to the community. And if you take it away, you've just lost an integral part of history that may feel local, but as we'll explore in these weeks to come, it's really of national importance as well.
Yes, absolutely. That was the idea. So,
but can I just say that to Randy's credit and to the Historic Preservation Trust credit, I don't think that appreciation, Tom, that you just mentioned about the value of that building and the additional asset that it was initially recognized. I think similarly so, the value of the Wat & Shand facade was not initially recognized. Both of those pieces of the puzzle of this project added significant costs and complications to the project. But ultimately, thanks to people that were really championing the preservation of the facade and the preservation of those homes, it ended up creating an environment that it was kind of a workaround how we're going to do this, and they did it. So I really want to credit Randy for what he did to make sure that did not get lost in the equation.
And it's a great example of how the Historic Preservation Trust and some others provided a platform for the community to voice what was important to them. Because I remember the series of public hearings, and one of the things that came clearly out of that was this community values the facade of Wat & Shand. And if that were to go away, you've just wiped out of our view something that we identify as being this main intersection in Lancaster. And in the same way, members of the community, voices from the community said, we can't lose the Stevens and Smith properties. We have to preserve them. So it's a really good example, I think, of how the push and pull of progress and the voices of a community that cherish and value their history, if you're willing to listen and engage in civic dialogue, you can find common ground and make both things happen.
Randy, I'm sorry to ask you this one other question, but the Montgomery House, which for those viewers is kind of the large house in between these two projects that we're talking about, did that have an easement on it, or was that did not, did it? That could have been torn down.
That could have been torn down, but amazing people stepped forward, and I'd like to share that as part of this. Elaine Holden, who was the originating director and a volunteer for the Historic Preservation Trust way back in the 80s, way before I got into town in the mid 90s. She was a visionary that said that building is incredibly important. She made an alliance with Carolyn Steinman Noonan, who was a part of the Penn Square Partners collection of people who were involved in this, and said that building is an 1804 incredibly important example of federal architecture occupied by an amazing person, a Revolutionary War soldier. It's got all of this cachet that can be an integral part of it. And those two dynamic women pushed that envelope to make sure that that building was made as a part. And we're all celebrating all of these elements today. The Watton Shan facade, the Montgomery House, and the Stevens and Smith buildings on the corner, they all make wonderful adjuncts to this dynamic project that we're now seeing the fruits of the vision that it is bringing vitality, much more vitality to downtown than almost any other city of comparable in Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic region.
Mm-hmm.
Randy,
Robin, jump right
I was
in.
just going to ask Randy, do you think at the time, so as all of this is unfolding, did a lot of people recognize the significance of our two key players, Congressman Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith, or did that come after the fact?
Well, I think it must have come after the fact. Personally, when I came to town, I was going to my job interview and I saw the historical marker at the Shriner Concord Cemetery where Thaddeus Stevens is buried, and I saw that name. And I have to say, I'm embarrassed that I didn't know virtually anything about the guy. And when it came time for me and my organization to become advocates to preserve that property, I had to learn about this amazing person. And I'm blessed that I was able to be a part of that illumination and that education, because a lot of people here didn't seem to know about him or didn't understand, and let alone this woman of color that he lived with for the last 20 years of his life, who was a person who really made form and content and allowed him to be the player that he was on the national stage. So there's so much to learn about these two people, and as they embody this property that we're now talking about.
I'd like to add, Robin, to your question that they were greater known nationally than they were locally. I learned about Thaddeus Stevens in my junior year of high school. My father required all 6 of his children to enter the Masonic Lodge's oratory competition on the Negro and the 13th Amendment. And in the preparation, and you won $1,000 to a historically Black college, if you won the competition. If you lost the competition, you were both in trouble with my father and broke, So we learned about Thaddeus Stevens in our preparation for the competitions. It was also the year of Love versus the state of Virginia, and the ruling about mixed race couples, and the passage from the positive concept of amalgamation of the races to the negative concept of miscegenation and the legalized separation of the races. And so movies like Imitation of Life and Pinky and Saratoga Trunk brought the question of why women of color who were light chose to either pass for white or take up the Black cause. And Lydia Hamilton Smith was promulgated in those early revelations as a woman of color who could have, and some said should have, passed for white, but chose instead to both acknowledge her amalgamation with Thaddeus and become a local host for the Negro Convention movement and the color convention movements, hosting Black conferences in her homes and in her boarding houses. So she was written into a history that was then torn out of our history books. And so this is a method of rediscovering, how daring their relationship was in a little village, walking down a main street together and holding their heads in.
And so if I could just contrast for a moment, you've got a journalist moving from Pittsburgh who comes to interview for a job and doesn't know yet about Thaddeus Stevens. And you have a young man growing up in Pittsburgh. Am I correct, Lenwood?
Right. Right.
who knows about Thaddeus Stevens. I suspect if you had gone down South Duke Street and asked any adult male in this community at any time in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, who's Thaddeus Stevens, they would tell you who Thaddeus Stevens was.
And
They
who
knew-
Lydia Hamilton Smith was.
Thank you. Yeah.
Because of the power of a Black woman owning real estate, managing a business, not only Thaddeus's estate. I mean, Lydia is well documented for managing Thaddeus's estate, for managing his calendar, for packing his trunks when he went to Washington, for planning the seating at his table, for hosting his guests. But she is also known for her school for girls, her boarding houses, her charitable contributions in a community. Again, as a Black woman, where you would have to ask her on the street, Troya, if she was Black. I mean, she, Lydia could have, should have, and some said would have passed for white if it wasn't for the astounding commitment that Thaddeus made to equity, parity, and justice. And so together they become this equation that is visible, is tangible, is audible, is economic, and what I excited about this program, and you can see I'm a person who doesn't get excited often. What I am excited about this project is not only what Randy and his colleagues did to preserve the exterior of the buildings, but what Tom and Robin are doing to preserve the interior of the inhabitants of those buildings. Because buildings are only significant because of the events that they housed, and I imagine the dinners and the cigars and the meetings and the speeches written at 1 a.m. in the morning, and the people who came both as antagonists and as advocates to that house. And it's a very exciting story to make history living, especially at the times of Black Lives Matter.
I'm going to take that as an invitation, Lenwood, to ask, and let me start with Tom Baldridge. Tom, why do you think this project, this effort, is important at this moment in our community's history, in our country's history? Any thoughts on that? Or another way to approach this is, what really drew you to this story and kind of ignites your passion for it?
Well, in some ways, as I alluded to earlier, it is, for me personally, it's a way to honor my father. So it's a gift to be able to be involved in this type of effort. But I think I'm fascinated to hear and learn that Randy Harris, a guy who I admire as a great man of history, was unaware of who Thaddeus Stevens was prior to his arrival in Lancaster. And that's the issue. I mean, Thaddeus Stevens, the more you learn, I think the more anybody would be in awe. The man had such principle and integrity, had his share of ruthlessness, but all toward an end. And the relationship that he had with Lydia Hamilton Smith was one of those circumstances where 1 + 1 equaled about 100 because of the way in which they were able to support each other and create the greater good that they were able to create. What is amazing about getting the gift of this project at this time in our nation's history is that we are at a time when we are really evaluating, some would say rewriting, whitewashing, whatever, our nation's history as it relates to race relations and the treatment of African Americans. And that, one of the things that strikes me, I'm going to a little tangent, forgive me, but sometimes I hear people when they talk about forgiving somebody that lived in the 1890s and had slaves, and they write it off, but that's the way it was at the time. Well, that was Thaddeus Stevens' time too, even earlier than that, and he wasn't like that. So you didn't have to be like that. you could be principled and act in accordance with the greater good for all human beings. And I think that is what Thaddeus Stevens did. And I think it's imperative that we honor that type of integrity, particularly in this time of really challenging race relations and race discussions across the country. In some ways, it's a shame that Lancaster is stuck with being the one that has to honor him, because he should be a nationwide figure that everybody should honor. But at the same time, it's an honor, and it's actually an obligation, I think, for Lancastrians to honor him, so that we can ensure that the rest of the country understands and can honor him as well.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm excited about this project, that we're going to be able to have that opportunity to lift that up and do that. And then, as importantly, and then I'll shut up, it's not about a museum. It's not, as much as we talk about the architecture and the building itself, it's not about that as Linwood related. That's part of it, but really it's about the dialogue and the discussions and the learning that we want to be sure that happens within this project, and how it embeds the fabric of the nation in terms of our opportunities to have discussion around race and race relations.
Great,
I mean,
great
I
point,
think-
Tom.
I think, Tom, what you just said about him being a man of his time, it's so spot on. We are constantly hearing in the news, in discussions about history, about even these issues regarding monuments and memorials, that these slave owners and people with significant bias and racism in the 19th century and earlier were, quote, products of their time. Stevens is a product of his time. Stevens is a man right in the middle of his time, and he's not just an abolitionist. He's an advocate for pure, true equality, and he was leading the way in ways
through education, which is huge.
And he's leading the way for other, abolitionists and activists. He's leading the way for Lincoln. He's the one who is out there beating the drum way ahead of his constituents and his peers.
And not only that, Robin, but the 5 top stories of the news tonight were speeches on Thaddeus's desk. Education, civil rights,
voting rights,
housing, the environment. These were all the things that Thaddeus was writing about and talking about. But just to use the vernacular, Troya, Thaddeus was bad. Thaddeus was dangerous.
Yeah, he was.
Thaddeus was so dangerous that he is the only person that is mentioned in the Confederate cause. When the Confederates crossed the border, they were not going to Gettysburg. They didn't even know where Gettysburg was. They were going to Harrisburg. Their intent was to wipe out the Pennsylvania Railroad at Harrisburg, which was the largest departure center. And they got as close as Carlisle, as the West Bank of Harrisburg and the Ridge. The black men of the Pennsylvania Railroad were building militia trenches. So they were called back to Gettysburg, and that is kismet and fate and history, and it elevated Gettysburg, but they had no intent. But they did have one order, and that was to burn Thaddeus Stevens' properties down. He's the only civilian. Now, when you think about that the only civilian that was targeted by the Confederate armies was Thaddeus. That's huge. And the first civilian that was targeted by the new movie industry was Thaddeus.
Like D.W. Griffith.
D.W. Griffith, his goal and role was to dehumanize Thaddeus
and Lydia.
I think, can one of you speak to that for just a minute to explain what you're talking about with The Birth of a Nation, the film in 1922, is it?
Yes.
1915, thereabouts. So the movie was based on a novel, a 1905 novel written by a Presbyterian minister called the novel was called The Klansman, and then it was turned into the first major motion picture epic 10 years later, as Tom pointed out, by D.W. Griffith, that created the absolute foundations of the motion picture industry that we still see today as an incredible powerhouse of social change, social influence. So, but what that motion picture industry did was carry out the most malignant portrayal of these two incredible humanitarians, Lydia Hamilton Smith and Thaddeus Stevens, as these evil connivers, antagonists during the Civil War and during Reconstruction, created them as the bad guys, while the Ku Klux Klan was raised up as the heroes of perpetuating the Southern good life, aristocracy, whatever.
And
that,
at the
whatever
same time, Randy, at the time of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey and James Weldon Johnson and J. Rosamond Johnson, who wrote the Negro National Anthem. At the same time that these are going on, the movie dehumanized African Americans by bringing back the minstrel stereotypes of darky, dandy mammy and high yellow gal, making Lydia Hamilton Smith the high yellow gal that Thaddeus Stevens is lusting after, which leaves residue that will take us the whole history of this project to scrub off of American consciousness.
Yeah.
I love it when the conversation gets so animated that folks are just jumping in and sharing their perspective on this. And it's a clue to all of us, and I hope all of our listeners pick up on this, that this is a complex set of narratives and stories with many pieces and many players. And we'll be exploring so much of that over these weeks to come. I do want to shift the focus a little bit here and ask Robin if you'll talk just a little bit about some of the early support for this project from some key players in this community and even on a national level. And let that be a signal that down the road, there's going to be some serious fundraising that will be done that will help to bring about what we hope will be a transformative experience for people. Robin?
Yeah, I think probably the story ought to truly begin with the people who supported the initial preservation effort financially. I mean, so many people got behind the first iteration of this project and pitched in to make sure that the facades were made as beautiful as they are, that the buildings were preserved, that they got as far as they did before the project came. It was transferred to Lancaster History's kind of care in 2010. And the reason why here we are in 2021, when we received, that transfer of care, is we were in the middle at Lancaster History of a major campaign for our headquarters. It was the middle of the recession. A lot of things had just gone down in the community. So major campaigns all across town. And we said, with great enthusiasm, we can't wait to take this project on to kind of pick up where it's left off and create a museum and living history center. But we need a decade to let people recover. So we had the fullest intentions to start fundraising for this project in 2020. But before we got to that point, back in 2019, we knew in order to do this right, and especially to do this right in a way that honored the legacy of all those other people who had gotten us to this point, we had to go through a pretty extensive planning process. We needed to have things buttoned down about what our interpretive plan looked like for this project, what our master plan looked like, so that we could really get the confidence back of people who had been engaged over so many years and how this was all unfolding. So we were incredibly lucky that first and foremost, one of our local kind of heroes for so many projects, the High Foundation, got behind this and said, we will back you in these planning measures. We will make sure that you get what you need to bring the right people to the table. And they matched a grant that was also provided us by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So off the bat, without even really starting, we're so lucky that we gained the support of, quite literally the national federal agency that is, it's almost like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval to get a grant from the NEH to say, hey, yes, we believe in what you're about to do. And then to have our local iteration of that Good Housekeeping seal of approval in the form of the High Foundation was incredibly meaningful. And what their support allowed us to do was bring together, we had this panel for 3 days in the summer of 19, where 25 scholars came together, and we just dug into the meat of this project. Everything from abolitionist history, 19th century political history, topics of race and gender and equity and equality. It was a pretty inspiring 3 days. And I'll look forward at different times over this broadcast in the next 12 weeks. We're going to be able to hear from some of those scholars who really helped lead us, I think, down the right path to what ultimately our interpretive plan will yield. The other thing that came out of that was the beginning of a community engagement process. And it really was just the beginning. I'd say in some regards, it was almost the prequel to community engagement, because that funding also allowed us to hire a consultant to start conversations with neighbors and community leaders, just to get the early input on what this project needs to hold. I think, when I say it's sort of the prequel, the meat of that component, the community engagement, is going to start back up. We would have ideally started that up again December and January, but community engagement is really best done in person, and none of us want to be sitting in a crowded room right now while we're dealing with the Omicron surge. So I think when we get closer to spring, we're going to have the wherewithal and the confidence we can start doing that again. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll stop talking, is while we were planning all of these things, we decided it was really important to pick the right partner for exhibition design. And we spent most of our COVID months, while we were letting things unfold, going through a process of exploring who could be our exhibition design team. Actually, everybody on this call was involved in one capacity or another. And Tom Baldridge or Linwood could speak to the fact that we had, at one point, I think we had an online session with 30 different exhibit design firms from around the country, and remarkable teams who have done remarkable projects. And long story short, we had 13 proposals. We interviewed 4 firms, and ultimately the team we've selected is a group called Ralph Applebaum Associates. And anybody who likes to go to museums has been to a Ralph Applebaum Associates designed museum. They are the team behind some of their recent projects include the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History and Culture. 30 years ago, they worked on the Holocaust Museum. 30 months ago, they got started with the process to do the museum component of the Obama Presidential Center. Their fingerprints are all over, exhibits across the planet. And what we valued most in their presentation to us was that they understood a commitment to diversity and a commitment to teamwork and a commitment to why this is an important story for Lancaster. So I hear you, Tom Baldridge, saying in some regards, like here we are, Lancaster, both as the, we're not in the middle of the Mid-Atlantic corridor. I mean, we are, but we're not DC, we're not Philadelphia, we're not New York, but we are the hub of so much history and so much heart for history. I think we're really lucky to be able to tell the story, but I think having a team that has national and international recognition that values why Lancaster is an important place to tell the story really is what sold us on them. So
Tom, I'd like to come forward with my comments from the other side of the coin that Robin just spoke about. I became drawn to this project originally as early as 2006, when I was director of cultural and heritage tourism for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. At that time, the Marriott folks were beginning to do the restoration of the hotel. At the same time, the Commonwealth was about 3 years out from planning the 150th anniversary of the Civil War in Pennsylvania, and the National Commission for projects, Civil War 150 projects, was being put out in an RFP. We began talking with Marriott about Lancaster and the Underground Railroad, because the national network, the National Park Service's Network to Freedom, was emerging, and I was introduced to Randy Harris. And at the time, I was saying, Randy, I've inherited a program where only 14 sites in Pennsylvania are recognized as authenticated network to freedom sites. Since that time, I'm really happy to say Pennsylvania has about 58 sites now. Randy has been really instrumental in helping sites craft their very rigorous applications. But we were looking for a hook, to put it bluntly, with Marriott. And we went to Temple University and their School of Hospitality and Tourism for their family reunion in the institute. And we said, what if we hooked Temple's Family Reunion Institute up to Marriott's site, and families who come to have reunions can look down into the Thaddeus Stephen and Lydia Hamilton Smith house and see the entrails of what might have been. So we weren't really thinking about Queen Street, Tom, or Main Street, or the facade, or its importance to the city. We were thinking about this interesting story of families who had come up through the quest for freedom, being able to stay in the hotel, have their family reunion, go down to the lobby, look down into what might have been, and imagine, as this architects of the 13th and 14th Amendment and instigator of the 15th were living in this house, what was beneath them in this a secret place. So we were looking for packaging history while you all were receiving the pass of the custodianship of this. And Randy was dealing with the integrity of the facade as a treasure. It is amazing that we're all on this screen today. Many pathways led to the same thing, but it was in the Ralph Applebaum sessions for me where it ceased to be house museums and began to be a center for democracy. And I think that that was a quantum leap, because again, it's not about the brick and mortar, although the brick and mortar is an astounding story in itself, but it is about what happened there to instigate democracy and what we are trying to do now to preserve it, which makes the project so relevant, and the conversation that Applebaum brought to the project. Such a quantum leap.
Amen to that. Amen. Randy, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to give us a very brief view of some of the upcoming sessions on this podcast. But before we do that, a number of you have mentioned the multiplicity of players involved in bringing us to this moment. And, you know, we have the former director of the Historic Preservation Trust here. We've already mentioned former volunteers and members of the trust. But I want to say in no uncertain terms, if it weren't for the remarkable work of the Historic Preservation Trust to latch onto this and make sure those easements were honored, and then followed up with a solid fundraising campaign and a beautiful, meticulous restoration of the exteriors, we would not have much to work with there. Folks now have gotten pretty accustomed to seeing the front of the Stevens and Smith house and thinking it always looked that way. Well, it sure didn't. It was a garage at one point. It was a restaurant at one point. The Kleiss was a paint store at one point. So my point here is the Historic Preservation Trust will always deserve a huge debt of gratitude from this community for taking the lead on ensuring that this project had a future.
Absolutely.
And Tom, I want to underscore that by saying tourism is a second industry in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is the fourth most popular destination for inbound travelers. So to have people who don't think they want to know anything about history staying in the Marriott and looking down into this sacred trust, you know, is bringing history out of the Heritage Museum
Yep.
and into the currency of the dialogue about animating democracy. And I think that's just exciting. Whether you love the facade as a treasure, or you go to the back and you look at the bones and the entrails, you are stimulated.
You are right. So we have probably just about run out of our time here, but Randy, can you take a few minutes and just give folks a little bit of a taste of what lies in these future sessions of this podcast?
Sure thing. Thank you. And thanks for that good perspective, Tom, about the Preservation Trust being involved in that activity. And I must say that the work that I did was basically to just elevate the ideas and to the concept planning. And you were involved in that very early on as you first came into Lancaster Historical Society, among many other people in the community who pulled the first ideas together. And then I moved on, and a lot of good people came after me and did all the raising and all the money and to create what you see there today. So it's been a hugely diverse and dispersed community effort to get us to where we are today. And I'm just so thankful to be a part of it. Amen. So talking about the projects and the ideas we have going forward that will illuminate some of these people who were involved and the historical perspective and where we are and where we're going to in the future. We are going to be talking on our next episode. We'll be talking about Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Smith as historical figures. So who were these people and why did they emerge from this chapter book, this Bible of history of America? And then we'll have Dr. Leroy Hopkins, who has been the premier African-American historian for this community for many, many years. He'll be talking on a discussion that I'll be engaged with, along with Mark Kelly, a gifted journalist, former journalist, and writer who has written a biography of Lydia Hamilton Smith. We'll be talking about the Second American Revolution, putting in perspective the major constitutional amendments that Thaddeus Stevens was involved in on the national political level, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the civil rights amendments of the mid-19th century that give us the shape and form of the civil rights movement that we're dealing with today. We'll have academics from across the state and across the country talking about those issues in one of these podcasts. We'll be talking also alternately between historical perspectives and contemporary views with guests who, like Ralph Applebaum and Associates and the gifted architects from Centerbrook Architects who are working in collaboration with Lancaster History to create the design going forward of what the experience will be in this site. We'll have representatives of those two organizations in a roundtable discussion like we're talking about today. We will have, let's see, who else we're going to be talking about. We'll be talking about the craft of historic preservation and preservation advocacy. And we'll be talking about, as Lenwood referenced before, the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, representatives from Pennsylvania, the Harriet Tubman Center in Maryland, and some other sites across the country who are knowledgeable about how the Underground Railroad story is emerging in such a dynamic form and giving life to it because, unfortunately, until recent years, we really haven't heard much about these stories in our classic everyday history books that kids really would have benefited and will be benefiting by hearing more about it as we develop this project. That's about it. I guess we'll be talking a lot of other things too.
We will. I think you probably touched on about half of the topics we're going to be focusing on over these next sessions. So please tune back in. You can see it on the bottom of your screen when those airing times will be. I also want to alert you to the fact that when you see it at any one of those times, you're going to hear some beautiful piano music. And the song you're going to be hearing, the lyrics and composition were by George Allen of Cleveland, Ohio, written in 1854. And the name of the song is The Underground Rail Car. It will be performed each time we run the program by Pauline Whitaker Abel. Polly Abel is a resident of Calvary Homes in Lancaster. She has been teaching piano for well over 75 years. And up until fairly recently, I think was still seeing students. Polly got this music has perfected it. We've recorded it now. So enjoy the music that will be the lead in and the close out of each of these episodes. And incidentally, Polly is the very distinguished age of 100 years. So, I can turn things back to you, Troy. I want to again. Yes.
Could I say
Please.
one last thing? In my introduction, I talked about leaving the performing stage when I lost my duet with Gravity, and I just want to say that Thaddeus was on the performing stage his whole life, and he was doing a duet with Gravity. Language changes, and so in his time we would have referred to him as a cripple, and then he would have been called handicapped and disabled, and now we say physically challenged. But he did go through his life with a disability, and he maintained the dignity through that pain, which what must have been sheer pain, and Lydia supported him in that pain and dignity. I was therefore so excited when Applebaum submitted their drawings to see that they included people on walkers and on wheelchairs and on canes in the design of the end users of the, and also exemplars of a piece of Thaddeus's life that we don't know. Which was
well, and on that note, we know that Stevens was a radical Republican. He was part of a radical Republican group, and we are determined to make this a radically accessible space for people of every ability. And you'll see that. You will actually hear one whole session of this podcast will be specifically on that topic. So please tune back in for that. In closing, I really want to thank each of you, Robin, Tom, Randy, Lenwood, Roya. It's been a great conversation. I think it's a good harbinger for how deep and rich these conversations are going to be going forward. So to everyone who has taken the time to listen to us, we thank you for that. We welcome you back the next time. And again, thanks for tuning in, and tune in next time.
Thank you guys. I learned so much listening. And what I would say to people listening, I'm so glad that Mr. Tom took it over. Because it would have been horrible on my side. But if you have not been to the Marriott on it's Queen and Vine.
Queen and Vine.
Yes, Queen and Vine. The Underground Railroad part is amazing. The whole place is amazing. And but I had the opportunity to look down at the Underground Railroad part because I'm a history buff. I'm a nerd when it comes to history things. So
I think you all need to look in and link up. Yeah, look in and link up.
Well said.
Yes, it is absolutely amazing to walk in that history, and that we had a lot, the Lancaster community, even back then. And I like what Mr. Baldridge said. There really wasn't any excuse. People chose to do what they wanted to do.
That's right.
And they could have done the right thing. And we're very glad that we have people in our community hundreds of years later. They're being honored because they did the right thing. So thank you.
They're also reminding us, Troya, that we have a choice today.
Correct.
We make choices just as they made choices, and we need to make the hard choices to finish the work that they were deeply involved in.
He is a very intimidating man to live up to, but the more we study him, or anybody would study him, the better off our society will be if we aspire to live up to him.
And if you think you're having a challenge with women in business in the 21st century, just imagine Lydia trying to do business in this community.
Troy, I'd love to add that if anybody's interested in kind of linking up with us, sharing their thoughts, asking us questions, asking to be put on a list of people who get notices from us, just send us an email at info@lancasterhistory.org and we'll get it and we'll be in touch.
It is. Because while you all were talking, the Lin-Manuel song from Hamilton, History Has Its Eyes on You.
Mhm.
This is this is such a true testament to that. And so thank you guys, thank you all for what you're doing. Again, this is WLAB's newest group of folk, and we're excited to have them on Tuesdays at 10 a.m., Thursdays at 10 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m. Also, you can download the app. But with that said, I think that's it. Thank you so much for the information. Thank you to everybody who's logged on to watch tonight. And again, you can reach them at info@lancasterhistory.org. I believe this is going to be really, really good addition to the group. So thank you all this evening.
Thank you. Freya.
Well,
See you again
Thank
soon.
you all.
All right,
Good
folks.
night.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.